Good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you. On behalf of the Harvard Club of the UK, welcome to tonight's presentation by Dr. Luana Marques. Dr. Marques is from the Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. I'm Victoria Leung. I'm a member of the board and events chair of the Harvard Club. Our club is the umbrella organization for the UK-based college graduates and alumni from all the Harvard graduate schools. We have over 500 members and we reached over 8,000 Harvard affiliates. This event is a collaboration with the Harvard Medical School and a shared interest group in healthcare. As you can well imagine, Dr. Marques' specialty and expertise on building emotional resilience and dealing with anxiety are in very high demand indeed at this time. We're very privileged indeed that somebody so distinguished in the field is able and willing to dedicate precious time to speak to us. As this is an interactive presentation, she is also able to hear our thoughts. We know that you're here just to hear her, so I'm not going to take up your time with housekeeping matters. We've posted information on logistics in the chat box, so please refer to that. And I'll turn it over now to Dr. Stefan Serban, our chair for the healthcare group, for an introduction of Dr. Marques.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Stefan Serban. I'm a specialty trainee in dental public health at Public Health England, and I'm the chair of the Shared Interest Group in Healthcare of Harvard Club UK. It is a real privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker for this webinar. Dr. Luana Marques is an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and the Director of Community Psychiatry Pride at Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Marques is a national and international expert in cognitive behavioral therapies and the leader in increasing access to scientifically rigorous mental health practices. Her decades of clinical and research experience implementing evidence-based practices encompasses all types of roles and settings, from frontline staff to CEOs, diverse communities to organizations, both in the US and globally. Dr. Marques is the president of the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, and the author of Almost Anxious: Is My or My Loved One's Worry or Distress a Problem? Without further ado, Dr. Luana Marques.
Thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you, Vicky, and good evening to all of you. Before I jump in a presentation, let me just share my screen and make sure that we are fully functional. And let's just 2 seconds. And you guys okay with my slides seeing full screen? Yep.
Yep.
Great. Yeah. Well, again, good evening. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of your Friday afternoon with us. I'm delighted to be here to talk a little bit about building emotional resilience during COVID-19. And we'll have sort of 3 parts on this presentation. We'll start a little bit with sort of what happens when our body faces fears, and specifically through the lenses of anxiety, largely speaking. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to manage this for yourself, how to take your own pulse of your emotional health. And then we'll talk about what are some of the skills that are based on cognitive behavioral therapy that will help you to really build resilience and strength during this pandemic. And as Vicky said, I really like to make presentations interactive to the best of our ability. So if you can, and on your computer, you can either use poev.com/Dr. Marques, or you can download the app, and that way I get to hear your thoughts. And so we're going to do that right away to make sure that all of you can connect, or some of you can connect, so that as we go through the presentation and we start to build this brain model of how to build resilience, I can hear your thoughts and also address some of your questions. So the first piece is, how has your work particularly changed since the beginning of this pandemic? What's different for you? And I'm going to pause for a second to see if I can hear some of you to make sure our poll everywhere is working. More isolated. Thank you. Sounds like we are functioning, working from home. I share that as well. Online. What else? Less structure, more work. Absolutely. So in many ways, I'm hearing several of you saying you're more isolated. You have a lot more work. You're working from home. Structure is harder. Zoom fatigue, absolutely. More demanding, much busier. Less collaboration. So again, some of that isolation that we're talking about. Zoom fatigue again, absolutely. So it sounds like many of you were able to log in. So I'm going to keep us going. We're going to be using this throughout the presentation. So if you logged in, please stay logged in to the presentation. But as I zoom out, what I hear from our Harvard community here in the UK, it's not different than I've heard all over the world, is that we have a lot more demands, but some of the buffers that we used to have, the ability to collaborate together, the ability to have that touch point, the ability to be in the office and closely with our colleagues, that's no longer there. And that isolation has definitely some negative impacts in our brain. And as the world really shifted, what we've seen is that the numbers of COVID are increasing. And I know there's some hope in the horizon, but as we stand today, we're always still in a position where our body is still responding to this acute and chronic condition of this pandemic. And as most of you know, our body and our brain is very intelligent. When it perceives any kind of danger, it activates our limbic system, the emotional part of our brain. And immediately what we're going to feel is that fight, flight, or freeze response. We tense up, our heart starts to pound, we get ready to really run from danger. And I like to think about this stress response, this biologically wired, very fast response through the lenses of what's known as the Yates-Dobson law. And what this shows us is there's really an inverse relationship about our stress level, our arousal, or anxiety, and our ability to perform. When we think about very low levels of arousal or stress, we also have very low level of performance. I often think about this as when you wake up in the morning, if some of you are like me and you haven't had that cup of coffee, your brain just feels a little sleepy, it's a little sluggish, it's hard to engage and perform. For you, what are some of the indicators that you are below your zone? So for me, for example, it's that sense of sluggishness. But for you, how do you know an indicator for your own brain that might show that, you know what, your brain's not in the zone? And of course, this might change over time. Bored, love it. Exactly. What else? You struggle, it's harder to focus. Absolutely. Sleepy, fuzzy. And again, we're building indicators for ourselves so that we then can learn what to do. You get distracted. And as you can see, this is a word cloud. So the more of us engage, the bigger we can see of some of our indicators of being really below the zone. Procrastinating, difficulty concentrating, easily distracted. Yep. Fuzzy, struggle. I'm hearing loud and clear that for many of you, you can see that you're below the zone where your stress is low, but your performance is low. When you're just feeling distracted, you procrastinate, you disengage. Well, what happens as that arousal increases? It actually also increases our performance. This is often described as being in the zone, when you feel like your brain is just flowing. Now, you might have experienced this in a work meeting. This, of course, would have been a pre-pandemic work meeting. But in times when you're presenting, for example, or you're brainstorming with your team, that you feel like your brain is just in the zone. What I like about this description and to think it through this lens is that anxiety can be adaptive up to a point, and in fact, can help us perform. So we took a stab at what it looked like to be below the zone. For you, what is the indicator, in one word here, that you are in the zone, that you feel like you're aroused, there's level of anxiety, but you're at peak performance, flow, love it. Exactly one of the words I hear a lot when I give this presentation, feeling like you're productive and energetic, you're flowing. Time flies, you're focused. Yep. Flow, time, focus, passion, energized, absolutely energetic, happy. I like this. You guys are not only giving sort of states in your brain, but also how does it feel? The emotions that come to being in the zone as well. You are more aware, you're more energized, you're more creative, passion, enthusiasm. And for those of you that joined us, we are talking about the relationship between our own arousal and ability to perform. And we are now in the zone on a flow state. And I hear that our team here, all of us are saying we're more productive, creative, focused, feel like you're buzzing, you're engaged. Well, as the stress increases, and for those of you familiar with the Dobson, what happens is we have a decrease in our performance. Eventually, that stress becomes so much that leads to anxiety, leads to impairment. It really affects our ability to function across all domains of our lives. And this has really been significant since the beginning of this pandemic. Compared to 2019, where there was 19% of anxiety and distress, 23% of the UK population has reported clinically significant levels of mental distress in April 2020. So what we're seeing globally is an uptick of depression, anxiety, and we're really seeing these reports of being more in that red zone again and again. And the consequences of this pandemic are very likely to be lasting for a long time. Let's anchor here on two previous things. One very focused in the US in September 11. What we know about September 11 is that 11 to 13 years after September 11, 10% of responders still had symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I only know the stats for the US, but if the pattern for COVID-19 were to be similar to September 11, that means just in the US alone, 10 years from now, we could still have 1.8 million first responders suffering from something as severe as post-traumatic stress disorders. What we see in the SARS survivors 1 year after, 64% reported symptoms of psychiatric disorder. So that's really, the consequence can be long and it can be severe. And I think that's why it's so important that the Harvard Club in the UK is taking this on to really start thinking about how do we build brain health? What are the key ingredients that we could be doing today to build that resilience so that we in the individual level and collective level can avoid consequences like this? And so that's what we're going to talk about next. And before we do that, I want to think about how do we pass tip the zone. And to do that, we're going to talk about really taking our own pulse, our own emotional health. And the way I want to do this two different ways. One, to really build a model with you so that you understand what happens to you when you are feeling like you're getting to that red. And we're going to do that through a situation, and then we're going to do it through a measure. So the first one is through the lenses of what's known as cognitive behavioral therapy. And just in a show of hands, if you know how to use the hand raise on Zoom, how many of you here have actually heard of cognitive behavioral therapy? Okay. A few of you have heard of it. I'm going to give it a second. Okay. So a few of you have heard of CBT. And the basis of CBT is this idea that a situation happens and that affects how we think about things, how we feel in our bodies and in our hearts, in what we do. So it's a very simple model to explain why at times we say things like, this is never going to be over, and we feel really stressed. And so I want you to now, as we move on, think about your own CBT model during this pandemic. And we're going to anchor on this situation. Imagine that you're looking at the news and you saw this. UK coronavirus cases up by 16,170 on Wednesday. So I'm sure many of you have seen this news before. Imagine that you're just there. The situation is in your phone and you're looking at it. The first thing I want you to tell me is, what did you say to yourself? What were some of your thoughts in response to seeing that news? This is bad. Exactly. What else? Some of you are already jumping to the emotions. Fantastic. Anger. I'm going to stay more in the thinking. This is going to be more complicated. What else? Not again. What's happening in my area? Absolutely. What should I do now? Same old story. Not again. So a lot of this, like, not again. This is lasting too long. So we looked at the news and we're saying to yourself, this is lasting too long. How did that make you feel? Now think about it for yourself in your own thought, anchoring that, this is going too long, not again. what were some of the emotions? And some of you had gone there already. Anger, besides anxious, good. Frustrated. And I wanted to encourage you to think about emotions, not only in terms of feelings, but also in your body. Some of you may have felt your heart pound faster. Some of you may have felt a little sweaty. Some of that physiology that also gets activated in situations like this. Frustration sounds like a lot of frustration, tension, resigned, sadness, tense, stressed, helplessness. So it sounds like a lot of sadness, anxiety, tension, and frustration. And so in response to those emotions, let's all together think about, what did you do in that moment? If you can put yourself in the situation, what was the behavior that you engaged as a consequence of saying, this is going too long, I'm feeling really anxious? Stayed at home? Ate? Absolutely. Shut down? Ignore? Had a glass of wine? Searching, so Googling. Some of you worked out, eat, look for more information, have a glass of wine, have some chocolate. Exactly. So look at this. Basically, what we're identifying is our own sort of CBT model. Some of you ignored, some of you looked, some of you had a glass of wine. And there's no right or wrong here. What I want to illustrate and help you sort of think about is this idea that a situation happened pretty quickly. We have specific thoughts that run in our minds. We feel something and we do something. If you said to yourself, I can't handle this, you probably felt really anxious. And a glass of wine in that moment probably made you feel slightly better, right? But sometimes we find ourselves spinning, right? In our lab here, Mass General, we call this the tab cycle: thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And the idea that when you're spinning, one way to stop that spinning is to really zoom out and go, wait a minute, what am I saying to myself? And really be watching out for black and white thoughts, or not thoughts that tend to get you spinning a lot. So we started talking about anxiety and what it does through the lenses of the Ace Dobson. We're now talking about pulsing your anxiety. One way is through the CBT model. The other way to pulse your own anxiety and to see if you're in the zone or not is to think about looking at measures that shows us if the anxiety is too much. I'm going to share a standardized measure with you. And what I want you to do is think about your answer to two questions, and then we'll talk about the outcome. So the first one, in the last 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge? So 0 is not at all, 1 some days, more days than ever, nearly every day. And again, I'd like you to vote, but I'd like you to also write down or remember your own number. Feeling nervous, anxious, and on edge. So here we have the majority of us either having more days, more than half of the days, or nearly every day. So if you look at it, it's exactly the curve I've seen across the world, which is most of us have an elevated baseline on anxiety since the beginning of this pandemic, which is also consistent with the data that I shared earlier on. Now, another way to ask this question, in the last 2 weeks, how often have you bothered by not being able to stop or control your worry? Again, 0 to 3, not being able to stop or control your worry. So it looks to me like, again, we have a good group of us. There are some days, and this seems a little less pronounced than the other one. So how do we make sense of this measure called the GAD2? If your total score is higher than 3, it indicates a heightened state of anxiety. So this, to me, during a pandemic, is a little bit of a warning sign. Am I getting to that red zone? And then what do I do about it? So let's talk about what to do about it. We spend a lot of time identifying for yourself where you're at, How do I fight the fight or flight and limbic response? Well, we really need to do it through the lenses of turning on our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that really allows us to execute, to think critically. And what we know is by activating our prefrontal cortex, specifically through the lens of cognitive behavioral therapy, can really stop some of that limbic response. We know the CBT is highly effective, and it's not only effective for our mental health, it also can boost our immune system. Now, I'm not here to ask any of you to become therapists, psychiatrists. I'm really talking about learning skills. And we're going to talk about three sets of skills here. We're going to talk about unplug and anchor, charge up, and then the idea to create a structure. And really, what I'm trying to share with you is not only the skills that you might have heard somewhere else, but what is the science behind? Why should we be engaged in some of those skills? Let's start with this idea of unplug and anchor. We are all bombarded by the news all the time. And we really need to find a way to really unplug a little bit and anchor. And why would we do this? Well, what we know scientifically is that being connected to the news all the time, specifically in case related to the pandemic, for example, can actually lead to more that limbic response. So this is a study done here in Boston after the marathon bombings, and individuals that watched 6+ hours of daily news relating to the bombing had actually a heightened stress response than those that were actually there. So watching the news all the time, although it makes sense, it's really creating that limbic response and getting you to the red instead of keeping you in the zone. So what we need to do is really anchor. And so how do we anchor? Really, what I'm talking about here is getting away from the news and doing something that helps to slow down your brain. And you know yourself best. Here we had an artist who drawing for her during the pandemic is how her anchor. A lot of the doctors in my hospital are talking about things like putting their phone down as they walk from one side to the hospital to the other, to just to be able to be in the present moment. So I'd like you to think about you now. What is one way that you can anchor? If we all were to commit to decrease a little bit of our news consumption to help our brain a little bit, what is one thing that keeps you anchored in the present moment that you can commit in front of all of us to perhaps do a little more? Swim, meditate, dance, paint, walk, yoga, music again, run, go outside, take a breath. Absolutely. So we're talking about decreasing that limbic response by unplugging for the news and anchoring. Your daughter, I have a 3-year-old at home, and I can tell you, every little hug will certainly anchor me in the present moment. Fantastic. So another thing to think about is if you're going to unplug, how to do that. And one suggestion I have broadly is to really try to anchor on the WHO guidelines of really watching the news maybe once or twice a day. Now with smartphones and TVs, it's really hard working from home. The access is there, but try as best as you can to think about really giving your brain a break to decrease that limbic response. For you, and I'm actually going to skip this one for sake of time. I'm going to move to charge up a little bit. So focus, we're talking about 3 things we can do to really keep us in the zone. Unplug and anchor being one of them, coming off of the news and anchoring the present moment. Now, I want to talk about charge up to build the brain health. And really, to me, the skills that I'm going to talk about here are things that perhaps were optional before, but right now I think are necessary as prevention to really keep us in the zone. Our bodies are very much like the batteries of our car. If we don't drive our cars, in fact, the batteries die. And this has actually happened to several colleagues of mine who've been working from home in the pandemic. One day they go turn on the car and the battery is dead. So for our physical body, we need to actually spend energy to get energy. And the 3 things that all of us here know, and in fact, some of you already said that you do as ways to anchor: exercise, sleep, and eat are super important. Let's just talk a little bit about the science behind it. What we know is a regular meal and a healthy meal can actually help with brain plasticity, memory, and learning. It can keep you back in the zone. And how to do this during a pandemic. And why am I even talking about this? Well, I've heard lots of times that people are so on, they go from thing to thing, they either forget to eat or they're eating things without even being mindful. So the idea here is really think about how to plan your meals and to the best of your ability to combat some of those things that you all said is affecting you, for example, isolation, by adding some social support. How about for you? What could be one adjustment that you can make to eat more regularly during this pandemic? And maybe for some of you, this is not a domain. I'm going to ask about a different couple of adjustments. Yep. Cooking in batches, wake up earlier. Let's think about committing together, planning ahead. What else could we do? At night snacking. Block time in my diary. Love it. Trying new recipes. So creativity. Plan ahead. Be organized. Fantastic. Virtual double date. Love that idea. So we're talking about looking at our eating, not because we want to just talk about eating, but because we are trying to help our brain the best we can to keep it on the zone. Don't eat to relieve boredom. Absolutely. Let's shift to sleep. Now we're all committed to fine-tuning our eat a little bit. Well, what we know about sleep deprivation, it's actually increased that amygdala activity. If some of our stress response is based on this fight or flight response, we really want to do whatever we can to bring that down. And we know that sleep deprivation is actually increasing it. We also know that difficulties with sleep can actually really damage our immune system. So how do we think about sleep during this pandemic? There's a whole body of literature called Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Insomnia that really talks about sleep hygiene. What I found clinically and through my presentations throughout the globe is that sleep has been disturbed for a lot of us during this pandemic. So I'm giving you some basic suggestions to, again, try to fine tune with the understanding that it is still something that's challenging. So one of it is this idea of unplug, reduce screen time as close to bed as possible. In fact, I often joke with my patients that your bed should have two things only. It should be only for sleep and for sex. It should not be for watching TV. So really trying to separate sleeping to any watching TV. Small snack before bed can be helpful. If you can't fall asleep for 20 minutes or more, get up and try to do something relaxing. And to the best of your ability, maintain a regular sleep schedule. One of the tricks that a lot of my patients are using is to do things like not keeping their smartphone right next to their bed, keeping it away so that if they can't fall asleep, they can't just look at their phone. Next thing you know, in the news and you're having trouble sleeping. How about for you guys, one adjustment that you can make to improve your sleep? I have committed, I can share with you, to really not keep my phone next to my bed. And it has made a significant change for me during this pandemic on being able to not feel so compelled to look at the news. How about for you guys? Stop using your phone, bend that phone from your bedroom. I like it. Regular bedtime, no time in the screen at night, same time to bed. Tried meditation, active metaphors, reading, love it. So again, we're building here your own toolkit. The idea at the end of this presentation is that you're committing in front of our colleagues here to really try to fine tune domains to help you really build resilience. Lastly, exercise. We all know exercise decreases depression, increases well-being. Some of you already shared with me that you run, that you do yoga, that you go out for a walk. So it's really important during this time. And I really want us to think about exercise not as going to the gym. And in fact, you may not be able to go to the gym, right? But really going to a Pilates class, right? Or dancing or taking a walk. On the top left here, you have my 3-year-old attempting to do yoga at home. Every day, we've been trying to do things like just putting a song and dancing, movement. Again, not because we are trying to build muscles, not that that's not great, but really we're trying to really move so that we can help our brains not be on that fight or flight during this pandemic. So how about for you guys? What is one activity that you can do to move this week? What can you commit to? Ballet, fantastic. What else? Swim, walking, yoga, running, every day. Love it. Hiking, gardening, Zumba. What I love about this, and I hope you've seen this, is for all of us, movement looks different, right? For some of us, it may look something like hiking or swimming. For some of us, is a walk. Dancing to a video, streaming, fantastic. So we're focusing on skills based on cognitive behavior therapy. We talked about unplugging from the news and anchoring in the present moment, really to try to get our brain here in this present moment. We talked about building brain health through charging up, eating, sleeping, and exercise, jump and start our batteries as a prevention. Skills, that things that we often did it before, but now I think are essential to decrease the fight or flight. Next, I want to talk a little bit about managing uncertainty and to really think about creating structure as a way to do that. Uncertainty is one of those things that actually activate our limbic system. Our brain does not like dissonance, does not like when things don't fit together, especially things that we don't understand or we can't predict. And unfortunately, in many ways, at a meta level, the only certainty we have right now is uncertainty. And so for many of us, our brains feel activated. It keeps trying to figure out, when is this going to be over? It's on, and it keeps trying to really deal with that uncertainty. So I want to talk about three things that have been really helpful for the people I work with clinically and are driven through research that can help your brain create a little bit of structure, because what we know is the structure actually decreases some of that uncertainty. We're going to talk about building boundaries, breaks, and leveraging connection. So why boundaries? And what do I mean by boundaries here? Well, many of us are working from home, and the boundary between your personal life and your home life has really decreased. But what we know is by having clear boundaries, we actually have better work-life balance, better health and well-being, and they actually increase our job performance, our motivation, and satisfaction. So it's really important to think about having some level of boundaries. Now, early in the pandemic, this was much harder. I've heard again and again that people are creating some structures here, but I have some suggestions on how to do this. First, create transition time. If you don't commute anymore, you're going to certainly know this, that before that transition time might give you some time to come up for air. It might give you some time to downreg from the day before you engage with your friends or family and significant others. So it's really important to figure out how to do this. I'll give a trick that I've been doing lately. I now tell my family that I'm done at work. Imagine if I was done at 4:30, everybody expects me to be done at 5. I give myself now half an hour, and I negotiated this with my husband so that we can have both that transition time, so that there's a little bit of a time to turn off the computer and to start to move on to the rest of your day. Turning off the news and email at the end of the day in your phone is also another strategy to create boundaries. I, for example, have taken my work email out of my phone from the time I finish work to until after dinner. Now, I do often check in the end of after dinner before I go to bed, but I try to create times when I have clear boundaries. And then once you create that boundaries, it's important to figure out what you're going to do with it, because your brain still may be spinning for an uncertainty. So the best you can, planning activities so that your brain know what comes next allows us to decrease some of that uncertainty. How about for you guys? What is one adjustment that you can make to set up boundaries? Or maybe one that you have made already that has been really helpful. Turn off notification, doing that. No calls after 9:30. Think 9:30, so I can see only a little piece. Silence your phone. Stop checking emails after 6 p.m. Love it. Walk in commuting time. Fantastic. Go for a walk. Plan your evening. Stop checking emails after 6. So it sounds like several of us have started to really do some of this. And my call here is that if you haven't, to attempt, and if you have, to really ignite that commitment to continue to set those boundaries. Let's talk about breaks. Setting breaks during work time is really hard for many of us, especially when in your computer and you have one Zoom call, another Zoom call. Some of you already said you're in Zoom fatigue, like many of us. But what we know scientifically is actually breaks can help tremendously. This is a really interesting study that looks at a judge's ability to make favorable decisions. So in the left here in the next, you can see from, the top is better favorable decisions. And as time goes by in a court of law, a judge's ability to make favorable decisions decreases. What does that mean? Well, when our brain gets tired and it's working and working and working, our ability to really activate the prefrontal cortex and really execute well goes down. Now, the interesting thing about the study is when you see the dotted line here, that's actually a break. So a lunch break in this case. And what we see is the judge's ability to make favorable decision goes back up in the baseline after a break. And this is just a lunch break. And so I like this article because it really helps me when I want to put, a break in my time and my day. It helps me think about why is it I'm doing this, that I'm really trying to help my brain to go back to the zone, to be in the peak performance. How to do this? I think it's crucial to actually engage and set up times for it. It's really hard. If you don't actually schedule those breaks, it becomes really, really difficult to do. So for you guys, how can you plan to take a break? And what I'd love to do is invite you to during that break to build energy. Let me define a break here. You have to be away from your computer. My staff, I've seen this happen. I say to them, let's end the meeting at 45 minutes and you have 15 minutes. And then they are sending emails during that time. That is not a break. So I want us to think about taking a break. What can you do? And how do you build energy? How do you charge up? Tea time every day. I love that idea. Before lunch, so a few minutes before lunch to be able to build that energy. What else? Walking lunch, yes. And I've been also doing some just walking if I have to take a call, go outside, walk in the evening. What else? We're taking a break to help our brain, but we're charging up during that break. Coffee at 1. Stretching. Fantastic. I'm going to keep us going on the last skill, and then we'll have time for the Q&A, which is really this idea of connection. This study is really important here. It looks across 70 independent studies, and it looks about the impact of social isolation in living alone on mortality. And what we see is there is a 29% increase in likelihood of mortality due to social isolation and 32% living alone. So this really indicates and highlights the importance here of really that social connection. And in fact, we know the social support and belonging with others is one of the strongest buffers against mental illness. And during this pandemic, that has been extremely difficult. Even though we've been creative and we're doing things like this coming together through Zoom, most people still talk about this idea of feeling isolated. So here, I really urge us to think about creating moments of connections that are really genuine, or to capitalize on things that you're already doing that can be helpful. Let me give you an example here. I have meetings with my staff all the time, but one of the things that we just started doing is having somebody lead the meeting, having a team check-in on asking a question that is something that we get to know each other. What's your favorite book? What are the things you're doing for the holiday? What was your favorite part of the weekend? What we're trying to do in our team is to build a sense of connection before we get to anything else we're doing. That's a little doses of connection. And of course, all of us are doing this with our families and others, but really thinking about seizing the moment to create connection as well. How about for you guys? What is one adjustment that you can do to make connection? People outside love it. Lean in. What else? One adjustment to make connections with others. Walk and talk. Champagne, I can't read the last one, but talk. Okay, here we go. Read out to old friends. Love it. Happy hour on Zoom. Meet outside. Phone calls. Beautiful. Thanking people in specific ways. I love that. Reaching out to other friends. Great. So keep us going for sake of time. But again, urging you to think about creative ways to maintain that connection as we're getting through this pandemic. So today we talked about first taking your emotional temperature, really understanding through a lens of CBT what you're saying to yourself, how you're feeling, and what is that leading you to do. We talked about that GAD2 as one way to measure your baseline anxiety to see if you're really off the zone. And then we talked about how to manage that. The idea of unplugging from the news and anchoring the present moment to the best of your ability, jump starting your batteries to charge up, and of course, managing uncertainty to structure, creating structure. Here in our lab, we have been doing a lot of this globally. And we, in fact, last year had launched a training institute to train everyone on some of the skills that we're talking about. Now, I know this presentation is really fast, and what I'd like to invite you to do is if you want to know more about the work that we do, or you want to hear more about those skills and think about how do you apply to my life or to my family or to my team, we created a course called Mental Health for All. And you can access it through my website, drluana.com. We'll link you there. And it's free for all, and it has 4 modules that 2 of which I spoke about today. Again, here's my website, drluana.com. There's a lot of free resources there. You can reach me through email there and all of that. I want to thank my team here at Mass General at Harvard, who really is really amazing, has helped me maintain these presentations and ensure that we are reaching our community globally. And I want to thank each one of you for being here today and for giving me this opportunity to speak to you and to hear from you. And I will end here and answer any questions you may have. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for this amazing presentation, and it was very timely and useful for all of us. Any questions on the chat if anybody has any questions potentially? While we are waiting for the question, can I just ask a question, please? Is there like an optimum time for having a break during your work day, or is it about frequency of having the breaks or the length of them?
So what we know is that usually you can focus, between 45 minutes to 120 minutes, depend on the kind of activity, if it is something that you've been doing a lot before, if it's a new activity. And so I think it's sort of individual to the person, right? And ideally you want to take that break before you hit that wall. So you start to sort of experiment, what I've done for my staff because of the Zoom fatigue, as I said, is I'm forcing everybody to finish meeting in 45 minutes to 50 minutes. So they have that 10 minutes in between as a way to experiment. For some people, it may be every 2 hours, but really trying to sort of gauge your tank of gas and taking that break and making sure it's often enough so that you have enough time to recharge.
Thank you.
Dr. Luana, this is Vicky. I have a question. How do you identify a baseline level of anxiety for an individual? Because for some individuals, they're just prone to anxiety and they could use that, they could harness that and use that as a motivating factor. So when do you think that it's, you have to act on curbing the anxiety?
So Vicky, thank you. So the first thing is this piece that anxiety is adaptive, biologically adaptive to a point. And I think most of us don't think about anxiety that way, right? But if you think about anxiety the same way you think about pain receptors, for example, right? If you touch a hot stove and you were not to have pain receptors, you really would burn yourself. So anxiety is signaling something, and up to a point actually helps you produce. When is it too much? Well, start to think about it this way. Is it getting in the way? Is it interfering? Am I feeling like you're working on a paper or you are trying to remember something and you're having trouble with the recollection? That's the early signs. Then there are things that are the classical. So concentration, sleep, some irritability and challenges in your body. Some people may have, panic attacks. That's when it starts to be too much. What I urge you to do is really just sort of check in with yourself. Because we're really talking here, ideally, the earlier signs before it becomes clinical and being able to sort of say, am I finding myself so uneasy that I can't actually produce? For the phrase that comes to mind for me that I think often is this idea that anxiety should be adaptive when it's feeling comfortably uncomfortable. When it's really uncomfortable, it's a problem. When it's really comfortable, you're home watching a TV, really not. But the comfortably uncomfortable usually is a good indicator that you're in the zone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks very much. I read about the phenomenon of a paralysis when you're paralyzed by anxiety, you can't even act, can't put it towards productive use.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Thank you. We've got some questions in the chat box as well. Someone was asking, Kate was asking, what can people do when there are stressful situations in a lockdown situation and they can't easily leave the house, except to take maybe a walk perhaps, but they're confined in a space?
Mhm. Thanks, Kate, for the question. So I've heard a lot of that recently because people are confined sometimes to small spaces, and most of the time you don't have as much time with your loved ones, roommates, family as you are having now because you're sort of all in the same space. So if you're really confined and you can't, so a walk is great. Equivalent to a walk sometimes is taking a warm shower or cold shower, but like walking away from the situation even momentarily. From dialectical behavioral therapy, there is evidence to suggest that even mental breaks can be helpful. So things like closing your eyes and visualizing a vacation, or spending time looking at moments that you had that, or planning future moments, but really trying to disconnect a little bit. So buffering a little bit from that existence of those things. The rest is really accepting reality a little bit, which right now is difficult, right? Reality is really challenging. So really maybe sizing our expectations and trying to do some of those little breaks as often as you can. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you.
Very good. We have a question, actually 2 questions from Andy. He typed up the question and then he modified it somewhat. Okay, I've had moments when I thought I was going mad, and then it passed. What is it all about? And then he reassured us by saying that I don't mean literally mad, more like claustrophobic.
More like claustrophobic, is that the question?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So it is normal for that fight or flight response to happen. And one way that may exhibit itself is fight, flight, or freeze. And at times I had patients say, I feel like I'm literally crawling out of my skin. Maybe that's the sensation. And momentarily, that's appropriate, right? We've been through a pandemic, and it's times all of the rules of engagement have changed. And so what I'd say to Andy is, if it's one little moment and it's not happening often enough, I would really conceptualize it as the stress response and to a very chronic stressor, right? That is this pandemic. And so first, accepting that it exists. Now, if it is feeling like is leading to things like avoiding places or anything that tends to be more on the clinical piece, that you feel like, that claustrophobia is preventing me from doing things, that's when I would suggest it's time to talk to an expert.
Thank you. We've got a question from John. It's a bit of a longer one. I think the idea is around a bit of frustrations that can come from the government policies. So how to deal with institutions and their gaslighting when they use lockdown as an excuse to shirk professional or moral social responsibilities. And it goes about those going against the core values that are to stand up for those important issues. Hearing the doublespeak from political leadership is very difficult. Mm-hmm. Any advice about that, please?
Absolutely. Thanks, John. So, I think there's a lot packed on this, which is how do we individually deal with the societal context that we are living, which the landscape changes. And I hear you talking about gaslighting and people talking on both different ways and in the moral values. So, it's hard to take a societal issue in a presentation like this, but there are a few things at the individual level that I might recommend, which is one, really be anchored on your own value system the best you can and be clear about what that looks like and what you stand for. 2, the best of you can align with people that support that, right? That the moments right now, we want to minimize that dissonance as I talked about. So really having more touch points with people that align with your value system. And 3rd, to the best of your ability and in a way that's safe, being able to have outlets to actually verbalize some of those concerns and be able to talk about it. And in some situations, it's not safe to do so. In others, it is more safe, it's safer to do it. I personally have written a lot of articles about the impact of this pandemic on diverse populations and my fears about what that looks like and things that we can do. And to me, that's one way that I can move the narrative and I can feel like I'm contributing to healing our world. But at the societal level, then I feel like I can't really take that on here. I hope that was slightly helpful, John.
Thank
Right.
you.
We have a couple of raised hands. There's Angeline Hinson. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and ask a question, please. Angeline, you are
Yes.
muted.
Can you, yeah, you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes. I just wanted to say that I really appreciated your presentation and the way it was actually put together. It's not really a question, but it's quite different from anything I've seen on Zoom. And there is a question I have about this. Is it actually designed in a way to there was something about it that was so easy to take in the information. It wasn't just the organization involved, but just the way it was put together graphically, visually. I mean, you went through a lot of material very quickly, but it was very easy to take in. And I think a lot of it had to do with the actual physical graphic presentation. I'm wondering if there was much, clearly there was thought behind it, but if it had some of this sort of de-stressing online communication involved with the presentation.
Thank you so much for your question. And so first I'll give credit to Anna, who does all my slides, who is my program manager. We've given a lot of thought to it. So what we've tried to do behind the scenes is to give people information a bite size and that it builds on the information in such a way that engages your brain to digest it. So the interaction is really meant to invite people to start creating memories behind it. And the pictures are designed so that there's one main piece of that picture. So it, sort of luck of the draw, I've done more than 90 of these webinars since March. And so we've been perfecting it. So I appreciate the comment and we'll continue to try to do it.
Thank you very much. We've got a question from Lennon. Is there an optimal or maximum screen time per day?
There's a maximum screen time per day?
Yeah.
So I don't know what the literature suggests, and I bet it is dependent on age. If I had to really think about the literature, I think what often we hear is to limit it enough so that you're not on all the time. I don't know of any data clear, and I think it would be actually hard to randomize and think about like what is the optimum amount. Think about your own indicators. So whoever asked that question, like what are you finding yourself that you're on and you're like checking out, or you're on and you're getting activated? That's why I use the idea of taking your own pulse, because if you start to sort of take your pulse and you're on all the time and you notice that your heart's pounding a little bit, you feel a little more tense, that's time to step away.
Thank you.
Right. There is no other question that I could see typed. Oh, actually, yeah. If I may ask a question, that'd be great. So yeah, Dr. Marques alluded to age-appropriate behavior. I know that a lot of us here have teenage children. I personally know quite a few of the attendees here. What advice would you give to parents who are trying to lower the anxiety levels of children? Because the advice that you gave, if we redirect that to our children, it's more prescriptive. It doesn't necessarily come from them. So it might, it might backfire, and instead of lowering anxiety level, it might make them feel like they're not doing the right thing.
You're absolutely right. So we actually did a summer internship for 150 youth this summer. We did through Zoom, and to teach the same kind of skills to teenagers. So those are high school students that we did with, so that we could deliver in the way they could uptake. So a couple of suggestions for the parents, and it's a more complex issue that I'm glad to talk to anybody. We've done a lot of trainings, for example, for teachers on how to manage emotional health for students. And we've talked to parents, so I'm glad to take it up broader. But a couple things. first, when it comes to teenagers, parents often feel like they want to solve the problem, right? We are responsible for them. We can see what's good for them. And sometimes it's really listening, right? And sort of pausing, going, tell me how it's going and what's going well, what's not going well. So first is that piece of sort of listening. The other piece that always works, doesn't matter how old your kid is modeling. So if there are things that you think are important, then you need to do it. This is really a silly example, but my husband and I had made an agreement to take our phones and put in a phone bowl after dinner time. That they were having a conversation. I picked up the phone to do something, and my 3-year-old looked at me and says, "No phone." Right? And so modeling that behavior is crucial. So listening, modeling, and then sort of really trying the best that you can to foster the things works for your kids. So your kids the best. If there's specific things that really you've seen help them before, then suggesting more of those things. And again, Vicky, it's more complex than that, but that gives a broad way to just bring the temperature down a little bit. Listen instead of telling.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. If there are any more questions on the chat box or anywhere. I see lots of positive feedback about the session. People are very happy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If nobody has any questions, we can close. I know that Dr. Marques has a hard stop at 7 o'clock our time, 2 o'clock her time. Thanks very much for everything. It's very dynamic, charismatic presentation and very pertinent indeed. We know you're very busy. We really, really appreciate you finding time for us and negotiating, the 5-hour time difference. So, in a normal year, this would have been one of the highlights of our year. And in this year in particular, it's just one of the brightest, moments at, for our club. And I want to give special thanks to Dr. Stefan Serban for making all this possible. And also to Anna Batuska, who is facilitating the technical side of things. We'll make the recording available very soon, and we'll also send you details on the free online course on mental health that Dr. Marques alluded to. You have all that in writing, so don't worry about it. And because you have the recording, you'll be able to go back and refer to things that you wish you had written down. So thanks very much for coming, and we wish you Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and Happy Holidays, and a very Happy New Year to a post-COVID era very soon.
Thank you, everyone. Wish everybody well. Take care.